Is your sourdough flat, gummy, or just confusing? That doesn't mean that you're bad at sourdough. It just means that you're missing one tiny little detail. Today I'm going to be answering your sourdough bread questions, the most common questions that I get. And we're going to be covering everything from dense loaves to how to make a starter properly. And I assure you that at least one of these answers is going to fix your sourdough problems immediately. So I'm so glad that you're back here on my channel. Today I'm doing a sourdough Q&A, and some of these questions I get frequently in my stories or in my school community. So this is completely beginner friendly, and if you've never made sourdough before, stay tuned because you'll learn a lot today. And this is made for real life, so busy schedules. Sourdough can fit into anybody's schedule. Anybody can do sourdough. And everything I'm talking about today is for real life kitchens. So you don't need a commercial oven. You can do this in your regular oven in your house. And if something's not covered in this video and you still have a question about it, please leave a comment down below and I may cover it in a future video. Or you could join my school community. I'll have the link down below. In the school community, we go more in depth. So we're not just piecing together random information from the internet. We have everything all laid out for you step by step. So one of the most common questions I get is, why isn't my sourdough starter rising? So obviously the sourdough starter is crucial to baking sourdough bread. That's what makes your bread rise. So if your sourdough starter isn't rising, then your bread's not going to rise and it's going to be dense and it's going to be kind of flat. And that's actually something that I struggled with when I started with sourdough. And usually the most common reason for that is that it is underfed, or your kitchen is cold, or you don't have the right feeding ratio. So what I mean by underfed is that the starter is not getting enough flour and water, and this ties into feeding ratios as well. So a lot of times when you look at beginner starter recipes, you go online, you search how to make a sourdough starter, they'll say feed your starter 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. What that means is 1 part starter, 1 part flour, 1 part water, and this is all based on weight. So it'll be like, 20 grams of starter, 20 grams of flour, 20 grams of water. The problem with this is that it causes your starter to peak really fast and then collapse. So it will go like vroom, vroom. And I personally also find when I do a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio that my bread doesn't turn out as well. It turns out a little more flat. So what I do is I do a 1 to 2 ratio, but the benefit of this is that my starter is more active and bubbly. But the key is to have just like a little bit of starter and then equal parts flour and water to feed it. And when you feed it more, it's going to be a little more active. And another problem I mentioned is that your kitchen can be too cold. So this can be more common during the winter. We're kind of going a little more into spring here, so it's starting to get a little bit warmer, but you might still struggle with a cold kitchen. And sourdough really needs warmth in order for the natural yeasts and bacteria to activate and feed inside of the dough. So if your kitchen is cold, I recommend putting your starter in a warmer spot. So that could be like on top of the refrigerator, or you could stick it in your laundry room. I've done that. My laundry room is always really warm. Another thing that I like to do is put my starter in the oven or on top of the oven. If you do this though, make sure that you put a little sticker or note or something so that somebody doesn't accidentally turn on your stove. And you could do this around the time you're making meals, and that will help your starter get a little bit warmth and make it a little more active. And to follow up with that, another question that people ask is, how do I know when my starter is ready? Well, a simple trick is to put a rubber band around the level of your starter in the jar. So if your starter's like this, you put the rubber band here, and then you can watch and see how much it's rising. So rising is a sign that it's active. Another sign that it's active is bubbles, and then also the smell. It should smell kind of tangy. It shouldn't smell bad. Another question I get a lot is, how do I know when bulk fermentation is done? So, I should have recorded myself last night. I was just making bread last night, and I was showing my kids, I'm like, this is how you know the bread is done. You just shake it back and forth. So you look at the dough, and if you shake it back and forth, it should jiggle in the bowl. And a lot of times for me, the dough comes up over the top, it domes over the top of my bowl. So when it's jiggly and it's domed like that, I know that it's ready to bake with. If it's still like it's only risen a little bit and it's still pretty dense looking, like it's not loose and jiggly like Jello, then it's not ready. It should be pretty bubbly as well. If you don't see any bubbles, then it's probably not ready. And it should look light and airier. And I don't recommend following the clock. So recipes will say bulk ferment for 4 hours, you know, or 4 to 6 hours. And then when you get to 4 hours, you're like looking at it and you're like, it's not ready yet. Everybody's kitchen's different and every loaf of bread is different. So even if you're making the same recipe over and over, you might notice based on the time of year, as I mentioned before, if it's warmer in your kitchen, it might ferment faster. So you really want to just look for the signs instead of going by the clock. So another question that I get a lot is, why is my bread flat and dense? And this was my number one issue when I started. Well, it can be because of a weak starter or not enough gluten development. So weak starter, we already talked about that, about how to make a strong starter. So if your sourdough starter is not rising, it's not strong, it's not going to make your bread rise. Another issue can be not enough gluten development. So that can happen because maybe you didn't do your stretch and folds correctly or you didn't do them enough. Another thing can be underproofing. So if you didn't wait until your dough was fermented enough, like it's not jiggly and stuff, then it's not gonna fluff up in the oven. Also, you do that final proof before you put it in the oven when it's in the Banneton basket, and if you didn't wait long enough, then it might not turn out, you know, the way you expect. It might be flat. Another thing that can contribute to flat and dense loaves is not enough steam in the oven. So this is why a Dutch oven is recommended when you're making sourdough bread, because it traps in the steam. But if you don't have a Dutch oven, then you could use a baking sheet and put some water on it. And you might have to refill the water a few times in order to get enough steam. And you'll want to keep your oven closed as much as possible to keep the steam in there. So another question I get is, why is my sourdough bread gummy on the inside? And this can happen if the center is not baked or if you cut into the bread too early. So if you didn't bake the bread long enough, obviously this goes for like most baked goods. If you don't bake it long enough, it's going to be gummy in the center. Also, if you cut into it too early, like if you just can't wait, you see that yummy loaf of bread coming out of the oven and you go like shh and cut it into it right away, it's going to end up being more gummy in the center. So that's why it's important to let the bread sit for at least an hour. I recommend closer to 2 hours to really let the bread finish baking. And this also can be caused by having too much hydration in the bread. So if your bread is overhydrated, you have too much water in it, it can cause it to be gummy on the inside. So as far as the internal temperature, it should be like 205 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit if you want to measure it. Now another question I get is, do I need a Dutch oven? And no, the answer is no, you don't necessarily need a Dutch oven. So I would say if you're going to be baking bread regularly, you want to have a Dutch oven. If you're just experimenting with sourdough and you're not sure you want to keep doing it, you could get away without the Dutch oven and just use the baking sheet with water like I recommended before. And some other alternatives could be a covered roasting pan. If you have one of those, you could use that. Or a preheated cast iron skillet, you could use that. And if you need more water, if you need a little more steam in there, you could just add a baking sheet with water. So the next question I get quite a lot is, how do I make my sourdough more sour? Now, there can be some different ways to do this. I found that when I made my own starter from scratch, that it wasn't as sour as when I bought a starter. I currently have a starter that I bought from Baker Creek Seeds when I got my seeds. So when I was ordering seeds, I saw they had a sourdough starter, so I ordered it. It comes dehydrated and then you reactivate it. And by the way, if you do this, their instructions that come with it are not very great. So I would look up online how to reactivate it. Other ways to get it to be more sour is a longer cold ferment. What I mean by doing that longer cold fermentation is putting your bread in the refrigerator overnight when you're doing your bulk fermentations, and using whole grain flour is going to help too. And another little tip that I have is letting your starter peak and then fall a little bit before mixing your dough. That's gonna make your bread a little bit more sour. Okay, so at the end here, I have some rapid fire questions. One that I get is, can I use all-purpose flour? Yeah, it depends on the recipe. Some recipes do better with bread flour or a higher protein flour, and some do better with all-purpose flour. It's just gonna depend on the recipe. Another one is, can I skip the stretch and folds? I don't recommend it. You really need the stretch and folds for the gluten development. And how often do I feed my starter is another question I get. And it really depends on what you want to do. Like if you only want to make bread once a week, then you only need to feed your starter once a week. And then during the rest of the week, you can just stick the starter in the refrigerator and then you just feed it when you need it. Always feed it right before you're going to bake. And can I freeze sourdough bread? Of course, absolutely. I recommend slicing it and then putting like wax paper or parchment paper in between each slice. That makes it easy to just pull 1 or 2 slices out at a time, and you can pop them right in the oven and toast them. And if this video is helpful for you and you want more from scratch living, sourdough baking, or gardening tips, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And if you want my beginner sourdough guide, please comment sourdough down below and I'll send it to you. And if you want step-by-step instructions on how to make sourdough the right way without overwhelming confusion, and if you want a helpful, encouraging community, please join my school community. I'll have the link in the description down below. Thank you guys for being here. I loved doing this Q&A session with you, and I'll see you on the next one.